Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Kurt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hey, Kurt.
Hey, Pep.
How you doing
See
today?
again?
Yeah,
I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah. I am, last week was a great start to this season. I'm really excited to delve into the first chapter of the book today, as we are, the book being The Deepest Place. I wish I could do it like Barry White, because he's got that the deepest place. I can't. I get too grovelly.
The
when I go
deepest
deep.
place. The deepest place, baby.
Oh, I like it. The deepest place, suffering.
Suffering, the formation of hope. Maybe I'm your hope.
You should quit your day job.
Maybe I'll form your hope.
Oh my gosh, you got to stop. So hopefully by now you've picked up the book and you've started reading at least the intro and maybe the first chapter, because we're going to be going through this book chapter by chapter this season, and we want you to be on board fully with us so that you get the most out of it. So we're glad you're here, Kurt. I'm glad to be with you today. I wanted to start, you start this chapter, chapter 1, Just Faith. You start with Romans 1 through 5, which is very much the center of this work that we're going to be doing. So I thought maybe I would start by reading that.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, that's public domain, right? We don't have to
the Bible.
Bible's public domain. We don't have to worry about somebody trying to make us pay.
You're gonna cite Paul and God.
Right. I think they'll be good with it. They've always wanted us to. They've always wanted us to spread the word anyway. They didn't want us to hold back on it. So I'm going to go ahead.
I just want to know what the royalties are for this. If you checked with Jesus about this.
Let's see. Okay, here we go. Romans 5, 1 through 5. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Romans 5, 1 through 5. And I know we're going to be talking a lot and distilling a lot of this verse throughout the remainder of this season as we go through the book and really seeing how it works in our lives in tangible ways. And the thing that stands out to me is the second half of this verse, because for so many of us, when we're suffering, we just can't imagine anything but the suffering. Or as we said last week, we ignore the suffering for as long as we can, and we try to cover it with other things. But this verse seems to tell us that suffering is certainly not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a journey towards hope. And hope isn't just, wishful thinking. It's a solid, sturdy anchor for the soul. And, that to me, we joke about the fact that we're doing a season on hope. I'm on suffering. But I want the listeners to know that it's also, and not any less so, a season on hope.
Right on.
I think it's important to know that, and that the hope isn't to mute or pacify or cover the suffering, but it's the suffering and the journey with the suffering that brings us to hope.
Yeah. That's so well said. We want our listeners to know that we will be looking unflinchingly at our suffering because we believe that in doing that, hope is where we find ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we look at our suffering in the context of the presence of the body of Jesus.
Yeah.
I have a friend, he's a priest at a Anglican church here in Northern Virginia. His name is Scott Buckout, and he preached a sermon that I cite actually in a previous work that I wrote about, and he preached a sermon that in which he talks about how formation is contextualized for us as followers of Jesus through number one, through the scriptures, number two, the Holy Spirit, and number three, the body of Christ. These are the three kind of this tripod of what we as followers of Jesus lean into. These are the things that we want to surround ourselves with to form us. And they are all three of those things are speaking to, each of those things is speaking to the other two things, right? The scriptures, we understand the scriptures in the context of the body of Jesus. I don't just read the text by myself. I read it in the context of a community who helps me understand. We wrestle with these things together. That scriptural text, that this, as we've said here before, citing our friends at the Bible Project, that this God-human, ancient, Jewish, messianic, meditative wisdom literature, and I love that. That is literally mapped onto the practice of being in community, in which we as a body of Jesus are actually reflecting not just what we read in the text, but we live as a body of Jesus as in the same way that the text was constructed and put together by all the Bible nerds, in the ancient Middle East who are putting this together, all under the hovering, guiding, authoritative presence of the Holy Spirit. And I want our listeners to know and to remember that that's what we're doing here in this podcast, that we are speaking in that context. And so when we're reading this text, we're not just reading it as this singular thing that's going to guide us. It's doing so in the context of the body of Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit that speaks to this notion, first of all, that to be human is to suffer, as we said in our first episode. And as you also rightly said, that for many of us who suffer, hope can seem out of reach. It's difficult because we often think of hope as a thing that, is I either have it or I don't. And my circumstances are often the things that decide whether or not I have it or I don't. I don't imagine it to be a thing that I form. I don't imagine it to be a thing over which I have the agency to form or not form. But that, in fact, is how the text, brings us to this notion of hope. It just drops out of the sky magically. It is a thing that is the byproduct of the formation work that we encounter when we move from suffering to perseverance to character and then to hope. But as we like to say, we like to begin at the beginning, because we don't just begin with suffering. Our lives don't begin with suffering. We often, there are some Christian traditions who make a practice of when if you were to ask them, like, well, what's the gospel? They'll say, well, the gospel is that we are sinners and Jesus has come to save us, and all of which is true. But the gospel actually, in the text itself, does not begin with we are sinners. It begins with the good news, not just that Jesus has come to die for us, all of which is good news, but the good news that we are made in God's image to begin with, that we were made to be his image bearers in order to create beauty and goodness in the world. And when we mess that up, he's not giving up on his project. And so, yes, Jesus comes because of the beginning. And the beginning does not begin in Genesis chapter 3. It begins in Genesis chapter 1, where we learn about what our purpose is that has not changed from the beginning. And so when it comes then to how we approach this text, we don't want to just begin with suffering. We want to begin farther back than that, where Paul actually begins. Because Paul, he knows the question is not if we suffer, but to what degree are we aware of it, and how are we in relationship to it, and how are we responding to it? Paul's assuming, because he lives in the real world. He lives in the world where people do suffer. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, like, I want to be hopeful. I just don't want to have to suffer to get there.
Right.
I want my hope to show up and kind of dispense with all of my suffering. I see these as kind of opposite things. I'm either suffering or I'm hopeful. And that's not the reality of the human condition. But we often have been trained to think that if I'm suffering, that hope is really out of reach. I can't know what it means to be hopeful. But Paul in Romans 5, verses 1 through 5, lives the whole different set of assumptions and helps us form durable hope through our suffering. So we don't get to that hope by beginning our conversation with suffering, as I mentioned. We begin in Paul's text by talking about these two theological terms, faith and justification. Now, we want here, for our listeners, like, this is a podcast about being deeply known. And when we read the text, when the texts come to us, kind of given our Western tradition, given our sense of being, we're wordy, logical, linear, analyzing people, we often think that if we just the abstract notion, therefore, since we've been justified by faith, it's kind of like these theological terms that have huge implications and power for the regeneration of our lives. But it's easy for us to forget that, like, those things, long before they are theological terms, first have to be experiences that we encounter in our embodied experience in the world. Faith isn't just this thing I believe in, kind of like, I believe in the Andromeda galaxy. It's out there. I've seen pictures of it. I believe it, but it doesn't have any impact on my embodied life. I can believe all kinds of laws of physics, but if I don't really live in or work in that world, it doesn't really have much of an impact on me. So we often just encounter those two ideas, faith and justification, in the abstract, without recognizing that they actually have their origin in embodied neurophysiological activity. We like to say in the world of interpersonal neurobiology that first we sense, and then we make sense of what we sense. We've said in other contexts that the Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, was well known to have said, look, first, long before we get to truth and before we get to goodness, first we have to sense beauty in the world, because beauty is the first thing we encounter that tells us what goodness actually is. And then I discover what truth is on the backside of that because of what I first sense. And so when it comes to faith, faith isn't just a thing that, is an abstraction. It actually amounts to my capacity to trust actively another human being, let alone trust God. And how am I going to do that if I don't have an attachment experience with a human being? And so what we come to discover is that faith that Paul's talking about is not first theology. It is theology. It's important to know that it is theological. And it's important for us to know that there are times when I need to call on that theology to instruct me at times when what I'm feeling and sensing isn't feeling very trustworthy. This is where the scriptures play their role. But it doesn't begin with this. Paul, before he writes all this stuff, has an encounter with Jesus on this road to Damascus, where he kicks him on his butt off his horse. What the heck? Now the guy can't see. This is real embodied encounter with the Jesus who's king of the world. And so this trust is not something we do before we act with our bodies. It is the very action of our bodies and minds in relationship with others. I don't first trust and then act. My action is the action of trust that demonstrates that. And so, I think of, again, we cited this in our last episode. Think about the number of conversations that you and I have had, that we've had with Amy, where we reveal things about our stories that are hard, painful, vulnerable, what have you. And we all have other friendships with which we do this. We make a practice of this. I don't first trust my friend. I don't first trust you, and then I tell you something. I trust you by telling you something. And it's risky.
It is.
And this is what attachment is all about. We've been justified by faith. The justification, though, I love what N.T. Wright likes to say, that we have been put in the right with the action of Jesus, which is an embodied thing. It is a real thing that happens in real time and space. It is not just an abstraction theologically. It is a real-time, active event in history. And in that act, God is saying to the world, welcome home. Adam wouldn't take responsibility for his stuff. Eve wouldn't take responsibility for his stuff. Abraham wouldn't take responsibility for his stuff. Moses, David, they all had trouble taking responsibility in such a way. Like none of them could get it right. And so I guess I'm going to take responsibility for what I've started. Finally, in Jesus, we have someone who can get the job done. And I'm going to hook my wagon to that horse. And I trust. I'm gonna live as if I believe that's how I'm gonna live. I'm gonna with an action, with my body. I have some embodied, felt sense that in that act, God has made things right. He has declared those who trust him, he's declared us not guilty. So y'all come. The question is whether or not I will. This is, I love in The Great Divorce, this famous fictional book by C.S. Lewis, in which you have a group of people on a bus that travel from hell to heaven. And in this, Lewis's character, as he gets to heaven and he walks around with his guide, George MacDonald. MacDonald's character says to Lewis at one point, at the end of the day, God doesn't send anyone to hell. People send themselves there. And this is what justification is.
Right.
Now, there might be those who will quibble with this, but all this is to say that all these things are embodied practices. See, I can believe in a Jesus because of how you and Amy have loved me. That's what makes him believable. The body of Jesus.
That's right.
And that's what trust is. I trust you and Amy. That's what I trust. And if I'm trusting you and Amy, I'm trusting Jesus. That's what I'm doing, because the Spirit is in this. And then what you're asking me to do, what we're asking each other to do, is as we have these foothill encounters of trust, we discover that we are asking ourselves to move. We've talked about this before in other seasons. We're moving from imagination to incarnation. Now, mind you, notice, folks, we haven't started formally. We're not going to get to suffering formally for a little while. And this is crucially important because we think that that's where we begin. And we're not beginning with Genesis chapter 3. We're beginning with Genesis chapter 1. We're not beginning with suffering. We're beginning with the verses that precede it, that tell us that Paul can write what he writes in verse 3, suffering, perseverance, character, hope, because of what he writes in verses 1 and 2. We begin with trust. We begin with, this is what we're going to practice. We're going to practice allowing ourselves to be known, to be deeply known, to develop this attachment, to develop in this way of confession, this way of telling the truth about our lives and being loved. This, and moving from what I imagine to be the case in my mind to incarnating that in the same way that the entire arc of the biblical narrative has done for us in the coming of Jesus. And as I have embodied encounters with others, I practice being receptive to being loved. We've seen this in confessional communities that we've talked about, these embodied encounters with the body of Jesus. My colleague, my partner, I sometimes call him my partner in crime, Courtney Morrison, who's the owner of our practice now, and she and I do a lot of work together. And yesterday we were working and planning on we're developing a training seminar, a year-long training project for clinicians around how do we train clinicians to run confessional communities. And this whole notion of, one of the things that we ground these confessional communities in is an anthropology that is a biblical anthropology. This notion that we as human beings are made as God image bearers. And that when my body when Kurt, when any one of the members comes into one of these communities, they are bringing with them in their bodies, they are bringing with them all the epigenetic, preloaded family of origin stuff into that space. And so everybody comes in, they just think, oh, it's 8 individuals who are sitting here in the room, without thinking, like, actually, it's 8 individuals with their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their children and their cousins, like all the embodied stuff. And like, dude, that's a lot of people in the room.
Big crowd.
And it's striking to see what happens when those embodied experiences meet the body of believers that are in the room. And so my trust is going to be developed as I encounter a body of people that are helping both to reveal, to heal, to convict me of where I need to make changes, but also where I can be recommissioned to imagine my life differently because I'm having this incarnated encounter here in this room. We like to talk about in this way the physics of the relational, the mass effect of relationships, that when Jesus comes for us, he comes, but he doesn't come by himself. He comes in the Spirit, sensing the presence of his Father. It's like it's a 3-on-1 fast break. Like you can't like they're good. They're coming. They're coming for us, and this is what we want to say to those who are deeply aware of where your suffering is. That we are coming for you. That Jesus says, we are coming for you. It's not just that I'm coming for you. We are coming for you. The Father, the Son, the Spirit are coming. And all the body of Jesus. We are all doing this work together. And this notion of being curious about what are my attachment processes like? By whom am I being deeply known on a regular basis? We can talk about justification till the cows come home as a theological concept, but do I feel in my chest the felt sense of hospitality? Do I imagine in my mind when I wake up that I'm heading into a day in which I've been welcomed into God's house? Like literally his house. Or as I like to think about it, like I think about my I think I've said this here before, David Wilcox and Rusty Old American Dream, the 1958 Cadillac that's rusting on the side of the road. As God comes and finds me, he takes me into his garage, and I look around. There's all these other cars that are also getting worked on, but but I'm in the garage. I'm not perfect, but I'm in the garage where we're all working on stuff. This hospitality, and if we are not in a place in which we are sensing others being hospitable to us and all the parts of us that we hate the most, it will be difficult for me eventually to get to a place where the suffering that we read about later is going to easily translate into perseverance and character and hope. And Paul knows this because this is all just the prelude to what's coming when he talks about suffering. So when it comes to hope, we talk about faith and justification, we talk about trust, we talk about earned, secure attachment as entering into the foothills of forming hope that is durable. And it's with that in mind that we want our listeners to be curious about who are the people by whom we're being deeply known. We always come back to this.
Yeah.
Such that I can practice being ready to name my suffering eventually. Because if I don't have those people, then otherwise I end up just thinking that, like, yeah, my suffering is really a matter of me trying to white knuckle it.
Yeah. And like you say, with those, with uh, finding those people, and it requires a risk, because if you're going to trust, you have to give the trust before you actually know know that you're going to get it back.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
there's just no other way.
No.
And so it's risky. And I've shared with you, Kurt, in the past that, I, like so many people in those kind of situations, um, there was some betrayal for,
Mm,
you know,
mm, mm.
and yet you have to keep going back to the well. You have to keep
Yeah.
dipping the bucket in the well and just trusting the next person, because
Yeah.
you'll find them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It is tricky, and it is also non-negotiable.
Hmm.
We don't have there is no other way. There is no other way for us to do this. Otherwise, we end up being on our own isolated islands, and our suffering becomes something that we are merely left to do with what we usually do with it. Like, I'm just going to try to get rid of it, try to distract myself from it, endure it. But I have a hard time imagining redemption
Yeah.
in the middle of all this. So as we get to the end of our time here today, we have an activity. Last time, the activity that we invited people to engage with, was just writing out some reflections about where you sense that your suffering takes place, or what are the things that you do to distract yourself from it, possibly. And then where you do sense an awareness of your suffering, what do you do in response to it? To what degree are we hospitable to it? And so forth. Today's activity invites you to reflect on what comes to mind when you consider notions of faith and justification. When you think of those words, how does it strike you to consider them in terms of embodiment? First of all, like, what is it? Is it just a theological concept, or is it? And with whom am I having an embodied encounter that actually lets me feel in my chest the awareness that I'm loved by Jesus? And so that whole notion of trust, that whole notion of attachment, how does our conversation today about those ideas strike you, and how does it shape and form what your experience of faith and justification are? And then, what have you encountered in the material world that provides an embodied experience of these theological ideas? For many people, the notion that faith is nothing more than, just an act of the mind, of the cognition. I have faith, like I trust that 1 + 1 is 2. For some people, it can be a new thing to consider, like, oh my gosh, this is actually a thing I do with my body. And I wonder, like, what are those places? Where are those places? Where are those relationships? Where are those kinds of encounters? And it doesn't just have to be with human relationships. I mean, we can have relationships with nature. We can have, as we've talked before here, we can have encounters with beauty that also grant us an encounter that opens our imagination to what it can be like to be loved. And so, what are some of those embodied experiences that enable you to imagine more deeply and more durably this felt sense that, yes, here's how I live faith in the world. Here's how I did it yesterday. Here's how I did it today. And recognizing that, faith by definition is like, I'm trusting something, which I don't have certainty. I can't guarantee outcomes. I'm trusting. I have confidence, but I don't have certainty. And what does it mean? Where have been those places where you've acted out of trust, out of confidence, but not certainty in the last few days? And where have you noticed that God has been faithful? Or where are there places that you are worried that God won't be faithful because you've got plenty of history of trauma that teaches you that people aren't to be trusted, and so therefore, like, how am I going to trust God? Where are those places where you might say, goodness, I would like, I want to practice faith in this dimension of my life, but I'm afraid to, because there's the risk of suffering, which I actually, as it turns out, am already carrying within me, but that I haven't named until perhaps this very moment. And as we
And
reflect
as
on
you were,
these things, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to just encourage people. Last week um, we encouraged people if they were doing the activities, if they felt called to email us their thoughts.
Yeah.
You can do that at beingknownpod@icloud.com. That's beingknownpod@icloud.com. You can also ask any questions that you may have there, because we're liable to end up this season with, if we get a lot of good questions, then we will do a Q&As and answer those questions on air. But we love to hear from you all. So please, beingknownpod@icloud.com. Give us any reflections that you may have on this week's activity. All right, Kurt,
All right, man.
thank you for today.
Thank you, brother.
Until next week, those of you who are watching on YouTube, stick around, because the one and only Amy, oh my gosh, Cella is going to be joining us.
Right on.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Amy.
Hello, my friend.
Hello, my honey. Hello, my darling. Hello, my ragtime gal.
I love that.
Yeah, we're going to have to cut it out there because we have to pay for it.
Oh, no, really?
I don't know.
Okay. I am so struck by the cognitive and embodied, particularly the embodied, the idea of embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
Kurt, you talk about in the book where somebody will tell you how they feel about you, that they love you, they care about you.
Yeah.
And you'll receive it for a hot minute, and then it lasts about as long as you turn and walk away.
Yeah. Right.
And that there's work involved in remembering that.
Totally.
And the beauty of it is there is work to be done. There are things that we can do. And we've talked about this before, I keep a laughter log, where if something makes me laugh.
Do I know this?
I think you know
you
it.
keep a laugh? Really? I don't know why I'm feeling like I'm hearing that for the first time. You keep a laughter log.
Yeah, and you loved it the first time I told you, and you love it again.
Because the log is just like, ha, 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 ha. It's just
that's exactly
different laughs how my log that she logs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's like my, oh my gosh. But, yes. and so, because I don't want to forget those things. Like there's
right. Totally.
And to look at the log, it just brings it back up. But that is the same thing. That's the same thing as remembering what people say to you, and it moves it from cognitive to embodiment. Right? Do I have that right?
Yeah. Right on.
And I was thinking, okay, so my therapist, there were times when, like I would go into therapy before COVID, when you could go in now too, and I would, for whatever reason, I would just want to take a minute to be quiet. But I was uncomfortable with that quietness. I thought she might be uncomfortable with that quietness. And she said, Amy, why don't we just sit here together? And I'm like, because I pay you a lot of money. I don't want to be quiet. No, but there was, and then, so fast forward to now, this was, it's ongoing, but so the other morning I was meditating and praying, and I wanted to be quiet. And my first response was like, No, that's not prayer. That's
Mm,
And what did I hear? I
mm.
heard my therapist say, "Why don't we just sit here together?"
That's so awesome.
And I'm like, that is how we embody God's voice, right? That's how we.
Mhm, 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 mhm.
Uh,
Totally.
it,
Yeah, I mean, we do this all the time in the confessional communities where somebody has a moment, has an
mhm.
encounter in which they've been loved, in which they felt understood, seen, whatever, and we will pause and we will ask them to go around the room and say, tell us what just happened.
Yeah,
Tell us what it was that each person did. What did you sense? What did you hear? Not just not just what were the words they said, but like what did you notice about their facial expression? What did you notice about their tone of voice? What do you notice that's happening to you physically as these kinds of things are happening? And they
right.
go around and do this. And of course, as they do it, it's not just good for them, it's good for the other people who have been offering this to them. Everybody is remembering, the entire community is telling the story over and over again. And then we give them the assignment every day until we come back again next week. Once or twice a day, we want you to take 3 minutes and do this moment again.
Mm.
Practice remembering this moment again.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, I think there's no, it's not a coincidence that the Eucharist is an embodied act.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
There's no coincidence in this.
Mm-hmm.
He could just as easily have said, hey, when you all gather, just take a few minutes and just remember my body and my blood. Think about it. Remember that this is really important. No, it's embodied.
Yeah.
And it's a crucial element for us to take serious, because the more seriously we take this embodiment, the more capable we will be, get this, the more capable we will be of comprehending how it is that God takes our suffering seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that do we take our suffering seriously, is do I really believe that God takes my suffering seriously? Because we'll get to this later on about how easy it is for us for many people who don't immediately, have cancer or who have a son who can't get off drugs or who have this, or like if your suffering is not horrible, then your suffering means nothing.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like we talked about last week, there are small suffering. I mean, not small. There are.
Yeah, I love how you illustrate this with Michael in
Oh,
the book,
yeah.
and how he gets to the place where God was something that he much more thought about than actually embodied. But I wanted to touch upon something that of the few things that there's only a few paragraphs that aren't highlighted, but
yeah.
But on page 28, you talk about we've been trained by many cultural forces over the last 500 years to believe that if something can't be measured in material terms, if it is limited to the imagination, then it can't be real, right? And then you talk about what do we do with the findings of research that demonstrate how athletes and musicians enhance their performance on the court or in the concert hall by repeatedly practicing these actions in their imaginations. And it's so spoke to me because it's the same thing as an actor. It's the same thing, it's
the grocery delivery boy.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
The elevator.
And it's just amazing, how from imagination to incarnation. And I think when I read, like, I've understood that as much as I could, but I think this particular story and this section of the book, it really kind of like a light bulb went off for me when it comes to, what you've been saying about that for a while.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I think it's hard for us. It's kind of like it's like anything, right? I mean, so my mother-in-law passed, and within the last month, and Phyllis, oh my God, I think my wife is adorable, and she utterly. There are just moments where she utterly delights me, And she came home one day. This is after her mom had died, and our daughter had flown home, and she was, and many people have been expressing their, their heartfelt condolences to her. And these are people that she's worked with, people from our church, or a range of different people. And she was walking out of Safeway, and Rachel was walking behind her, and she turned to her and she said, "I just can't. It's just so wonderful. Like, there are just so many people who love me." And she said it, and she said there was this older gentleman who was walking in, and she's like looking at him when she's saying, "There's so many people who love me," and she said he had this look on his face of like, "Okay, okay. right." But I mean, but the point is, like, you could. You might believe that in the abstract, and it might be true.
Uh-huh.
But when people bring you meals, when people are sending you flowers, when people are leaving things at your door, when people are calling you up, when people are writing you notes, when people are coming for you in an embodied way, it's like, wow.
Oof.
When I was in acting class and we would be preparing for a scene, Charles Nelson Riley would always say, "Use your imagination. It's free. It's free. You can use it. It's all there."
Oh my gosh.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is good.
Well, thank you for today, Amy. Thanks for your insights.
Yes, right on. Right on. It's beautiful.
Great.
Yeah, this was
Thank you.
a great day. I look forward to next week.
You too.
Until then. We'll
Okay.
talk soon.
All right, love you guys.
Love you guys.
Love you.
All right. See you.
This podcast is produced by Kurt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. Please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.